Okay, it is 11 o'clock. We're going to jump straight in. We have a packed hour, a big topic, assessment, something that is just central to everything that we care about in education. It's incredibly important. Sometimes we hate it, sometimes we appreciate it. Always interesting. So you know, kind of why this, why now? Assessment could have been a topic every single year, and it probably has been. But you know, right now we are very focused on personalization, right? Getting many more students over a much higher bar, thinking about how education and schools have to change, the kinds of things we need to develop in our students. We also have a tsunami of learning sciences research, much more that we're learning about the brain, how it develops, what's going on. We also have, you know, sort of this improving understanding about learner variability and how people are different. They develop differently. There are many more factors associated with learning than we expect, and there is no, there's this kind of new idea that there is no average, right? So much of our testing and assessment is based on this notion of finding this average and comparing against an average. So there's that, and we'll, I'm sure, get into that. There's also a plethora of data with the new tools, the technologies. With digital, there is so much data and a jagged understanding of how to use it and what it means and whether it's reliable and that kind of thing. So the big question is, you know, what about measurements and assessments? Are our measurements and assessments leveraging what we are understanding about people and learning? Are they leveraging the plethora of data? Are we switching it up? Are we able to innovate in this incredibly interesting space? So that's what we're going to talk about today. The title, which I did not give this panel, was Is Measurement Woke? So I did not make that up, but you can read the rest of it. Have an awesome panel. Looking forward to listening to all of them. So I'm Karen Cator, and I'm the CEO of Digital Promise. And we have a big mission to spur innovation to advance learning opportunities. So we are laser focused on advancing learning through every means possible. And so assessment is one of those means. Okay, so first I'm just going to ask the panel to introduce yourselves in just kind of a sentence about what you do and who you are. Joanna, you want to start?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joanna Gorin. I'm the Vice President of the Research Division within Educational Testing Service. And I came there, previously a faculty member at Arizona State University in the College of Education, arriving the year that Michael Crow arrived there in 2002. And the transformations in education are permeating all the way to assessment. And so I'm really excited to be here and talk a bit about that.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Pugliese. I'm with Arizona State University, Senior Fellow for Innovation, as well as Director of the Action Lab, which is a research instrument that we work with the ASU Online and Advanced Technologies to research efficacy.
Hi, I'm Marten Roorda, the CEO of ACT. I joined ACT in 2015. Before that, I've been working in educational technology for a long time, since 1999. First in e-learning, later in assessment with an international testing company out of the Netherlands. So at ACT, I'm driving transformation and innovation.
Kerns, Vice President and Chief Academic Officer with Renaissance. Came into the position after 20 plus years teaching administration, third generation educator. So we like to say it's in our blood and it's around our dinner table. And at Renaissance, we've been working a lot in the areas of practice was our initial product line into assessment. And we're really dealing with this topic of personalized learning as you brought up.
My name is Burr. I'm a research scientist and software engineer at Duolingo, which is a language learning app. My background is in machine learning and artificial intelligence. I did a lot of research in an area called active learning, which means something different in machine learning than it does in education and pedagogy, but it's related. It's machine learning algorithms that can ask questions and formulate hypotheses in order to improve and interact, usually with human teachers to improve the learning algorithms. And since I joined Duolingo, I've been kind of doing the opposite of that and working on, you know, how can we use machines to improve how people learn. So a lot of the personalized adaptives and assessment work that we're doing.
Excellent. So lots of deep expertise. I will be the sort of acronym and deep, weedy, get out of the weeds type of person. So we'll make sure that we kind of keep this at a level that everybody can really benefit from. So Joanna, you are ETS, so old and long-standing.
70 now, 1 year old.
Yeah, how many years?
It's 71. We were 70 years old last
71
year.
years old. All right, so there you have it. So so much of modern measurement ETS has been involved with for many, many years. So what does that phrase kind of, is measurement woke? What does that mean to you? And a little bit about maybe what you think it needs to be woken up to. But what do we need to also save from our history and background?
Yeah. Something we are thinking about, I would say, every day at ETS and in the measurement community, as we see a lot changing around us in education and society. I actually think woke is, in a way, the perfect word. It's not disrupted, it's not awakened, because it really is about being challenged to look closely at what's happening in the world every day and not just think about it from within our walls and within our offices and within our science. Educational measurement was initiated to be able to provide fair and equitable information for decisions to be made to give people opportunity. And I think that is something that none of us would say we ever want to do away with. It's about gathering evidence, the best evidence that you have that can back the claims you want to make. And that comes in the form of data. And we always need to make sure that we are tempering whatever claims we can make based on that data with what we can back it with. So I think that absolutely has to stay. What needs to change, though, is what we define as evidence. And with a lot of the technologies that we're seeing here, we have access to new types of data that allow us to look at many different types of interactions and performances and behaviors that we can now value and evaluate if they're reflective of the things that we want to measure. Artificial intelligence, I think, is an incredibly powerful tool that we should be leveraging, but always making sure that the technology's gotten so far out in front of even the wonderful advances we've made in the learning sciences. We just don't necessarily know enough about what that means. So I think what we need to make sure that we are doing while we're changing and evolving is think of what we can take advantage of in terms of all of these technologies to better measure what it really means to learn and to know something, but not to lose sight of the fact that we still have to evaluate the data as evidence. And oftentimes there's more data than is really meaningful to be able to do what we want to do.
Excellent. Actually, Marten, I'm going to ask you to go next. So the ACT, what do you have, like 15 million students or something like that take that each year?
We have 50 million of assessments each year for all of our programs.
Yeah. So lots of students.
It would be great to have 50 million assessments for the ACT. That's our goal.
Yeah, you impact many, many students' lives with these assessments. So what do you think about this topic and just kind of opening thoughts?
Yeah, so the impact is there, and we'd like to see, the traditional assessment, apart from all the new developments, we try to move the traditional assessment as well. So this is about, creating a better experience, digitalized, more authentic, and also, I think what's important to provide much more information than just a test score, and so that the ACT is more like a select in than a select out. So that's one way to look at that history of ACT, which is 59 years. It's a bit less than ETS, but okay. And the other thing is, I think, is to be able to provide an answer to the now what. So you have your test score and your test report, so now what? So that's what we're working hard on, is to turn ACT into more of a learning company so that we can provide, or we can make the outcomes of a test actionable, and connect the information to, for instance, educational resources, so that you can improve, you can accelerate or remediate whatever is possible. So I think in this new position of ACT becoming a learning company, what's important to keep, and where we, I think, as a testing industry, can differentiate compared to all the initiatives like we see here at the summit, is, and that's why we're well positioned to take a strong position in learning, is that we can provide the rigor that's needed to get right evidence and right information out of learning. So there's three elements where I think we can make a difference. First is in providing validity. Because of the measurement, we can provide that. The other one is, I think very important, is transparency. So we're very transparent about, for instance, our algorithms and the way we connect learning to measurement. We publish about that in the journals. We make that visible. We don't create black boxes. And the third and final one is efficacy. So the measuring of efficacy is built in our architecture, learning architecture. And so that's done continuously and in real time. I think that's well needed, and that's the reason why, with our history and our our capabilities, we have a very strong position in educational technology.
Excellent. And Burr, ideas, opening thoughts about measurement and,
I come out of Duolingo, which is an education company, not necessarily, we didn't start out as a measurement company, and I don't think of ourselves as a measurement company. But in order to reach our goal of personalized adaptive instruction at scale, if you solve that problem well, like if you have an algorithm that can drill you on the things that you need to be studying at this particular point, taking into account your history in learning this concept, how likely you are to have forgotten it. It's also something that we don't necessarily talk about in the science of learning. There's the difficulty of the items and the abilities of the student, and then the likelihood that they'll learn it over time, but then there's also forgetting. If you solve that problem well, then as a byproduct, it basically is an assessment. You have the algorithm that can fine-tune and drill into a student's ability. So I think that as educational technologies become more pervasive, reach beyond necessarily the classroom, they certainly have ways that they can enhance the classroom experience, provide new information to teachers and to the students themselves, but people who are outside of a traditional classroom setting. Like we have, not even just in the developing world, but here in K through 12 US, students in rural America who don't necessarily have access to foreign language programs can have learned enough on Duolingo to, once they get to college, can test out of 2 or 3 semesters and then save thousands of dollars in tuition. So now I'm just rambling.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a good opening. Great. And we'll talk more about machine learning and AI, because that's obviously super central to this. And feel free to ramble. I'll just, listen.
I'm a rambling man.
All right. And Gene, so Renaissance has also been around for how long?
Well, since our first product was 1986,
Okay.
so
A
comparatively, we're kind of new, but
Yep.
over nearly 80 million assessments last year, so scale's pretty large.
All right. So what do you think about assessment, and where is it woke?
Well, I actually want to play off something that Burr said, because he talked about scale. And here we are at a conference that is deeply touted in innovation. And years ago, I bumped into a definition of innovation that U.S. Department of Ed uses. I think it's really helpful, because they say to innovate, it's 2 things. It's the impact. You've got to be doing something that's significantly better than what you were doing. But it's also got to be coupled with a scale. And getting those 2 is huge. You can have a couple of people doing something that's really impactful, but it never makes scale. That's not an innovation. That's something else.
I think that can be traced back to Steve Jobs, actually. But
okay, well, they didn't cite him well in the document I had. But I think it's that. But also, too, I think here we are in the sphere of innovating. But I think it also goes back to the first topics that would ever be brought up in an assessment course. Is it reliable, and is it valid? And as we start experimenting with new platforms and new approaches, we need to be honest. We're going to trade our current problems for new ones. Hopefully, we'll be in a better place. But as we start opening up the ways that we assess kids, we're likely to bump into all sorts of interference that makes getting that reliable score way harder than I think we first think about it first.
Okay, excellent. We're going to put a pin in that too and come back to that reliable score issue. And Lou, opening thoughts.
So I'm not a psychometrician. I'm a practitioner, and trying to observe how these new psychometric models are put in practice. And the word woke to me means somebody who's coming out of a deep sleep and hitting the snooze button 15 times, right? So I think we're at 7. And so, my sense is that, we're in a challenged area because psychometric models were really modeled after basic skills assessments dating back from 1926. And in a world of new technologies and data-rich environments and adaptive learning, the question then becomes is, how do we advance this to be able to adapt and keep up with the type of technologies that are available? The other thing is not necessarily about the debate about methods and models of psychometrics and what's right and what's wrong and different types of practices. It's really about drawing a connection between assessment and the teaching practice, right? So this is where we have a big disconnect. And we know a lot about learning science, but we don't necessarily know how to connect it to the teaching practice. And so we have a really big challenge today in trying to connect these to real learning outcomes and to really make a difference, in terms of intervention. Assessment is data, and unless you have data and can draw a straight line between that and intervention, you can have the best psychometric models in the world, we still have a challenge.
Yeah, and let's just sort of take that apart just for a second. So there are different kinds of assessments, as hopefully most of you know. There are the summative assessments, which are the big standardized tests that you take once a year, and it gives some information. There probably isn't a direct line from that to instruction, because they're not really designed to say, here's what you do next, and that kind of thing. But they're meant to give you an idea about how you're doing as a system and in a little bit of how a student might be doing as well. Then there are the formative assessments, right? And these are sometimes taken every 3 weeks, or they're kind of benchmarks, and they're taken along the way. They also can be, but they're meant to inform instruction, let someone know what the next play is, and the who it's letting know is a question we should talk about. And then there's embedded assessments that are right inside of products, and many of you probably are working on either products or ideas that takes the data within the product, embeds this assessment, and it makes judgments about perhaps the recommendation of the next play or the next screen or something like that. There's a lot to talk about in all of that, but let's kind of stay kind of for a little bit in this notion of instruction that does have, or assessment that does have a straight line to instruction. So this notion of formative assessment, right? So what are some of the, and maybe we can start with you, it's like talk more about kind of machine learning and AI, and what are some of the advances that can be put in place so that the instrument actually even gets better and better as it's used?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different opportunities. I guess the way I think about, there's a couple of things about this. So one is almost a warning, I guess, to my own people. I don't know who out there is actually an AI person.
Who's an AI person, machine learning? Anybody?
All right, there's
yeah,
like 2 or 3 hands that are going up. But there's a tendency, I think, in my own community and field to when approaching a new problem to just, we've got this really awesome hammer and that's a lot of nails.
Yeah. And to maybe overpromise perhaps? No?
Maybe that too. I'm not an overpromiser, but sometimes it's not necessarily hubris, but like maybe short-sightedness of there's a whole context, If you're in language learning, right, you should know a little bit about language when you're, building out these technologies. And so there's a real challenge to not just treat this swath of data as something to just start throwing algorithms at, because you want those models that you use to be interpretable. So you want to understand what the AI systems are learning about your students.
Yeah.
Because they might be learning the wrong things. That has implications for fairness and equity. It has implications in all other kinds of ways. And that transparency then also has implications for what kind of information can be then exposed to educators in a classroom setting, or to the students themselves if, like most of Duolingo users, it's self-study.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of opportunities there, but I think the onus, I think, is both on traditional educational systems to be open to these algorithms coming in, but then there's also a responsibility to use the right technologies and put in the extra effort, not just minimize your error rates, but actually have parsimonious systems.
Excellent. Others, new advancements. What do you see as the advancements in kind of a formative assessment?
Yeah, so formative assessment, the terminology is something that I think trips us up oftentimes and makes it difficult to have the conversation, because there's an assessment that happens before I'm making a final decision and that I want to use to predict what that decision is going to be. And then there's information, as Burr was saying, to reveal what the student needs next, and that can be a process of iterating on that and then trying out different interventions and instructional units. And I think that what we're really talking about is more emphasis on the latter, really talking about what to get into the hands of teachers and what do they need. And I think thinking about, you know, the limitations of the psychometric models or our definitions of reliability, those certainly, I think, have been limited in what's been in operation. But the bigger issue is we have many, many, many more models that we can never actually create assessment or learning opportunities to give rise to that data that we really want. And so we have to think simultaneously about what is it I'm trying to understand about what a certain student knows, about their misconceptions, about how they're going to develop. What is it I know about how to teach that and actually engage them in an activity that I can see that? And then how do I think about modeling that data? And I think we know a lot about probably each one of those separately, but if they're not designed together, the system's not going to work. And it really is about a coherent system, all the way from the summative assessment to the interim that can be predictive of how they're doing, to the formative. They have to be aligned on that. And that's that straight line that may go through some different layers, but you will make it straighter if you start with that as the design principle from the get-go. Unfortunately, I will say that's hard to do because you've got different people working on the different problems. The summatives being worked on by some groups and being defined in terms of what it has to be at the state level or the federal level. The districts are the ones who are purchasing instruction, and then the teachers are in the classroom on a day-to-day basis figuring out what the student knows.
Okay, so you're uncovering a tremendous number of barriers.
Sorry.
No, then that's
barriers,
super
yes.
helpful.
But
I mean,
opportunities.
Right. So then what are some
Absolutely.
of the advancements that you're seeing that are promising? And
So I would just say that, you know, we currently, just to point it around redefining formative, I think that can be dictated by the type of technology advance that we have, right? So, you know, in a world where Amazon knows it's going to ship you the package before you even know to buy it, right? Or you're mapping a human genome in ways we couldn't do before, we should be able to completely redefine that in terms of not a slice in time of formative assessment, summative assessment, but an ongoing iterative measurement of a student progress. You know, we have the Apple wristwatch on our phone, it takes our heartbeat. In a digital world, that changes everything in terms of how we define it.
I was just going to bring up, there was a recent journal issue, NCME, the National Council for Measurement and Education. A special report came out Q1, and it was about this very issue of assessments that can inform instruction, using models of, actually even sometimes the idea that models of assessment could be insightful to education. For example, all that we've learned about learning progressions and the stages that kids go through there. But in one article, Scott Marion, he did this great summary of research, and what he said is, let's look at what we know from the research. And he didn't use the term formative, summative necessarily, but he divided between, you know, high stakes assessment and assessment at the classroom level. And what he did is he had this litany of research saying, look, it's always at the classroom level where the difference is made. And what's so interesting is, and sad, is that's not where we've invested. You know, the money, and that was driven by policy as well, went behind the high stakes tests. And so he has this litany of research that says it's about changing what teachers do every day in their classroom and helping their practice at that level be informed again and again and again. That's where we get growth. But sadly, that's not been where we've invested. So it's kind of interesting that this dialogue of formative continues. And I mean, if we'd invested 1/3 of what we put behind high stakes tests at classroom level assessment, we'd probably be at a different level of performance nationally.
And I'll say, agreed.
Amen.
He's
I
woke.
like that.
He's woke there. So in terms of those specific examples, most of them are in the research communities, and I think that's why oftentimes people aren't necessarily aware that they exist because we haven't figured it all out. But I'll give one example where AI, I think, is having some real implications for what it could look like. As a faculty member, I taught a statistics course, and I would give my assessment, my regular test, and the students would do poorly perhaps, and say, well, I couldn't show what I really knew. So I said, okay, let's have a conversation. And I'll ask questions and we'll talk and I'll probe. Inevitably, we found out they knew much less than it looked like they knew on the test. But the idea is, we know from tutoring and we know from other experiences, conversations are a great way to assess someone.
Yeah.
Well, with spoken dialogue systems and natural language processing, we're actually building assessments that are essentially our dialogues between the student or the person, the examinee, and then a peer and a teacher that are virtual. And you can really structure that conversation to give rise to pieces of evidence and probe and follow up. Now, that's only meaningful if it's based on an understanding of what you're looking for, that learning progression, and that you have some type of model that's able to say, do I score everything they utterance, or do I put it at an aggregate? And so we're working through those things. Bringing it to scale is going to be challenging, though, because until we can get it into large-scale use, the amount of data that you need to be able to actually really validate it and know that you're not missing the mark, it's going to require partnerships, I think, across a lot of different sectors.
That is super interesting, and you could totally see how that could scale. Marten?
Yeah, so we definitely see the trend of, assessment of learning moving into assessment for learning, and even so for us the next stage is assessment integrated in learning. That's the real big thing. But I wanted to make a comment about assessment in general. So I think we should try to move away from that term, because assessment is creating kind of an image of students sitting down for a test and being assessed. I think we should take a much broader view on that. So if you talk about measurement and collecting all kinds of data, if it from conversation or prior measurement or any other, maybe even out of classroom data that you can use and expand that vision, there's much more information that you can use in creating information for the student, for the teacher, recommendations, etc. I think measurement is a better term, and it's also where you have the opportunity to make things more personalized and adaptive. And so if you look at the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's a lot of opportunity there. For us, it's important for all aspects of our organization at the moment. First of all, in making personalization and integration possible. So the way we connect measurement to learning, for instance, the algorithms, but also how we catalog content automatically. And on the other side, it's also an internal thing. So a way where we can automate the processes, for instance, by scoring automatically or generating content automatically, like generating test questions or educational resources. So it's having a big influence in our organization.
So we've experimented at ASU for the last, 5-6 years, roughly about 8 subject areas, about 60,000 students in the adaptive learning environment, which you could say is an early form of AI. And what we're finding is that as we begin to go up the level of sophistication, meaning starting from these early decision tree types of adaptive systems to more algorithm-based adaptive systems that really require better diagnostic models, we can start to see the ability to move from just measuring cognition and intelligence, surface knowledge, to really measure competence in terms of what students can actually do. Yeah. And I think that's the most important thing that AI promises. So.
Yeah, tagging on something that Lou said a few minutes ago, you talked about historically assessments, we've been limited in what we were able to assess, and often it was relatively low-level, straightforward type of thing. Mark Wilson did a recent article, and he was talking about the concept of signification. And what he was saying was, so you have all these standards. Every teacher figured out pretty quickly that it was only a subset of standards that we were really able to directly assess. Yeah. And of course, that's what we did. And as a result, it really had a limiting effect on what actually got taught. It was that vicious teach to the test cycle where, well, they're never going to assess that, so why should I spend time teaching it? Because I'm not going to get any credit on that. So I think one of the greatest opportunities we have with all of these new models is to address that, to address
Yeah.
that fact that through new models and new approaches and new technologies, we can assess, or we can hopefully get to the point where we truly assess the breadth and the depth of the entire curriculum and standards.
And next generation science standards, I think, is the place where we're seeing the most opportunity right now. Those standards are incredibly challenging to understand, to articulate in terms of the curriculum, to generate curricular materials. But the technologies in AI that are going to allow us to get the students to and observe them doing the science, the practices of it, and the process data that comes out benefits us from both the summative, okay, so now I'm really measuring what I wanted to get at, even if I'm reporting out on it, but also that process of, were they randomly manipulating variables, or were they thoughtful in saying, I need to hold this one constant and move that one. NAEP has started to look at that kind of data in their interactive computer tasks, and it's a wonderful place for innovation. When you don't have to have reliability at the individual student level, you can relax a little bit. And I think we need to find those opportunities where the claims will allow us maybe to have evidence that's a little bit weaker, and that's where we can experiment and really explore with these new innovative methods and see what kind of good evidence they provide and how we can get that back to the instructors, the teachers, the kids.
Yeah, that's excellent. We know what is assessed gets taught, to your point. And so other thoughts on this? This is a hugely important thing. You know, if we think about, again, the proliferation of AI and the different jobs that are going to be available in the future, it's not going to be about what you know. It's not going to be like, can you remember this or that? It's going to be about, you know, collaboration and problem solving and creativity and innovation, those things that are, you know, uniquely human. And so you've actually pulled out some really interesting things. One is listening to someone think and analyzing and assessing or measuring or giving feedback on how they're thinking or on how they're solving a problem, you know, how they're going, their processes and some of those kinds of things. Other thoughts on this? This is a super interesting space.
I think that this is a little bit not necessarily off topic, necessarily dealing with technology, but you know, it depends on, you know, not necessarily the methods of how you assess, but what you assess too. And so we're always used, the industry is engineered to assess cognition and what people learn in skill mastery. And so we're starting to see a whole new wave in the last 5 years of non-cognitive and social emotional measures.
Yeah.
And you know, one measures, you know, surface knowledge to mastery, the other is a predisposition to learning. And so, you know, we started to run a couple of interesting studies on this and looking at, you know, just the cognitive model and saying, okay, we're going to assess what students learn and predict their ability to succeed in an environment, match that against a non-cog assessment. We did roughly about 15,000 students. And now the data changes. Now it radically changes and the intervention changes. So we're starting to make some breakthrough progress, and others in the industry are doing so as well. So.
I want to connect back to something that Marten said, because you're totally right. The term assessment has been
It's bandied about.
But what's so interesting is, I don't know whether it's woke or not, which is what we're trying to figure out, but it's been hijacked for sure. Because if you actually get back to the root of the word, assessment from its Latin root means to sit beside. There was no judgment, there was no ranking, there was no rating. Evaluation.
Your salary didn't depend on it?
Yeah, your salary, and that's a really important point. But I think that all goes back to this case for where we really need the investments is, again, at the classroom level. It's the sit-by-side level. It's that dialogue and that feedback at that level that makes the difference.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I agree. So if you look at like one day in a classroom, if you really look at what measuring is going on, it's the majority of the time, because people don't realize, but you know, students practice all the time. So teacher explains and then practicing, it's all of that feedback loop. So if we expand our scope from just assessment to, you know, everything that's being measured throughout the day inside the classroom, we can really take a very different view, and you know, and there's a real opportunity to help the teacher with technologies to make that process more accurate and create some acceleration and improvements there.
For sure.
A few more examples of how we are pushing with AI beyond what could be traditionally measured, but then a caution, because that seems to be my theme. Collaboration.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work being done. PISA is one of the few assessments that actually has an assessment of collaborative problem solving out there. There are others that are being developed at ACT, at ETS, and other places. And it really does require very complex ways for people to interact.
Yeah.
That's scalable, which requires technology. So whether they're solving problems virtually in different places, they're talking to one another, or chatting with one another. Communication, just oral communication came out to be one of the most important learning outcomes that higher ed institutions were interested in, but they don't know how to measure it in an affordable, scalable way.
Yep.
New technologies with vision science and multimodal analytics is able to help us with that. And finally, even something we're working on around cross-cultural competence. And this isn't just for students. This is for people in the workplace. This is for teachers. We know that the world is becoming increasingly diverse,
Yeah.
and to be effective, you're going to have to know how to negotiate across those. So we're building formative games that are looking at how people are able to become aware of cultural norms, of avatars they're interacting
Yeah.
with, and how they get better at understanding those and then letting that affect their behavior. Wouldn't that be great if we could actually use an assessment to be able to help people to interact more successfully with one another across any number of environments,
Yeah.
to help the educational system, but really to help society in general?
Yeah. Burr, you've been trying to jump in here.
Just synthesizing a lot of these things, you know, there's opportunities for AI and machine learning and technology to create totally new full stack kinds of assessments for the soft skills or some of these other things at the individual level. But even, I think there are even like shorter term, you know, wins that we could have to allow technologies that are not that far away to enable and enhance. So for example, if there is a teacher in a classroom that is using a particular solution like Duolingo, for example, in a foreign language
imagine.
classroom, and as part of that could provide a dashboard so that the the teacher understands this entire class is struggling in this area,
Yeah.
and here are the high, medium, and low performers in this area throughout the whole class. Put together a classroom group exercise. Here are some recommendations on how you might want to formulate those groups.
Yeah.
That's getting the students to engage in the material in a new way. It's getting the students to practice these soft skills that are important. And even though maybe the technology doesn't really exist yet to measure those skills well, it still goes back, I think, to what you were talking about. These things start in the classroom. And so
Go ahead.
well, I was just going to say that we're not that far away from what we have now to enable those kinds of things to make teachers be force multipliers.
So I agree 100%. And so the issue really is what can we do today, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so one of the things in some of the adaptive work we're doing and the early machine-based applications is, back to the teaching practice scenario, and what can we do today is we're applying adaptive math, algebra, advanced algebra and calculus in an adaptive environment. And the two things that have merged is, one, it allows the teacher, to your point, to be able to diagnose the classroom and really understand how to apply his or her time against the instruction and the remediation, which is breakthrough unto itself, right? And I think the second thing is, if we think about how that changes the teaching practice and what we need to do to inform things. And so, for instance, the other success factor is not just adaptive learning and adaptive learning for itself, but combining it with things like active learning exercises. And what do you do in addition to adaptive learning that may be more traditional teaching methods, or maybe competency and group-based assignments? Those are the things that really matter, I think, when you mix that.
Yeah.
So I forgot my caution, and both of
I
these
was just
comments
gonna ask you
reminded
what your
me of
caution
them,
is. Yeah.
which is just applying the adaptive algorithms or the new computational models. If the content's the same as it was before, and that wasn't necessarily designed appropriately to give rise to that, you're going to have a hard time really actually navigating people in paths that are very reliable. So you said, Burr, just for example, well, we don't need the measurement piece because we're just going to group the children and do this. And
I didn't say we didn't need it, but
Right.
we could still take action even though that's not in place
We
yet?
can, but I think we need to be very conscious of the fact that we may be making an arbitrary decision to group people if I don't know enough about whether that data really is more signal than it is noise.
Right, but those have
Which
been-
is maybe better than where we are
Yeah.
now, and that's the experimentation part. But I think we just need, and that's what I was trying to say at the beginning is, great, then let's say we're going to experiment, but let's not then put some type of stakes or claim on it at the end that says we know this was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
There's really not that much evidence out there that personalization leads to the best learning for everyone. Some of these systems we have to think about for children who are disengaged and who interacting with the teacher every day is one of the best social interactions that they have. What happens if you sit them down in front of a system that's incredibly personalized and adaptive, but they're just kind of alone there? So we need to do more work about who is this good for? When is it good for them? How does it work? Under what conditions? The math, we know a lot more because that's where the research has been going on a lot longer for. We have better models of cognition and learning underlying it, but there is a limit to that. And so we just need to, I think, temper what we're saying we can do, but also not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and to be willing, and this is where I'm talking to my assessment community, is saying, hey, it doesn't all have to meet that high standard. But it's also the case that just because it's not a high-stakes standardized test doesn't mean it's low stakes. If I'm telling students to go down a path and they're spending 2 weeks of their time on something that they're completely bored with or something they can't do, that can have some negative impact as well. So just have to, I think, be very cognizant of how we're using the information, where inequities or fairness could be an issue, and how much we can claim behind it.
Yeah, that's great. And there are a lot of other cautions as well around transparency, privacy, security. Like there are lots of cautions around all of this. But maybe we don't need, just I guess, everybody remember there are lots of cautions associated with all of this around all of those kinds of things.
Opportunities, invitations to collaborate, I guess is how
the
I'm
things
thinking
to keep
more.
in mind. But let's just spend a minute, because a few years ago with the Common Core, the Department of Education funded a lot of money into these new assessments of the Common Core standards. Does anybody have any insights into what happened with all of that? And were there any promising advancements that came out of the two consortia in terms of item types or sort of innovations that
That's an easy one.
could be?
I'll take that a little bit. I mean, I heard people say maybe some things didn't come out. Certainly the investment didn't equal the return.
Yeah.
But I read, again, an article the other day, and one of the authors said was, well, first of all, one of the problems was it was summative. And we talked about formative, summative.
So it started with summative.
Again, it wasn't at the classroom level. That's not where the difference is made. But
Yeah.
also, it's like you can say you wanted to build information for teachers, but one drop of summative can taint a whole lot of formative and interim.
Indeed.
So it was the policy, but then also too, it was too closely baked into the test. The grain size probably wasn't all that useful to teachers, and the timing was off.
Yeah.
So it sadly became another example of where we invested.
Was there
Several.
any interesting that did come out? Anything
So
good that
I
did come out of it?
think an interesting conclusion, and I bring in a bit of an international perspective here, is even though the consortia were very dependent on government funding, and their efforts were not too impressive. So I think the fact that we were looking at standards is very interesting. There are many examples throughout the world, and especially, of course, I know a lot of them in Europe, where the development of standards or a national curriculum brought a lot of quality improvement to education. So, and if we look at the future of learning, where we go to integrate learning and measurement and navigation, like in one system. So there's one thing we should be aware of. We would definitely need very clear learning objectives. It's not about what you mentioned earlier, the average. The average is not interesting. So here we have to have clear reference. One example is the ACT holistic framework, which covers all of the cognitive and non-cognitive skills, cross-cutting capabilities and navigation skills. So we need to cover all of that, but we have to have at least one kind of framework or reference, or maybe a catalog of constructs. So we have to measure by where everything is moving, like in being adaptive. We have to have one clear goal that we have to aim at. So I think the introduction of the Common Core state standards, and you see those translated into many different state standards, will still be very, very important in the future. You see developments where these standards and the crosswalks between them will become increasingly important, especially in adaptive learning.
Yeah.
That's
One
my
other,
prediction.
I think, positive that sometimes may get overlooked, and I'm trying very hard to see a positive in that huge investment, is the requirement to report on the subgroups, which is incredibly important. The requirement to be inclusive of who has to participate in that process. Because one of the best opportunities in summative assessment is for civil rights to make sure people have an opportunity to learn, and we see where there are the inequities. And the work that we've done around some of the state assessments, I think the places where we've seen really exciting advances are on alternate assessments, where we have to think very creatively about how to get better evidence from students that may process information or demonstrate it differently, and accommodations, accessibility, some of the technologies that we have now in terms of haptic devices, and other ways of interacting and demonstrating competence. Some of the best things that we have in the world came out of work that was actually originally done for accommodations and accessibility to people, and then they are universally very well accepted. So I'm going to say that that's a plus that I think has pushed us to think more creatively about how to include more people into the educational process.
Yeah, that's excellent, excellent. And I actually want to push on that just a little bit. Are there other things? So equity and fairness, those are incredibly important, increasingly important, getting many more students over a higher bar. Many of us grew up taking time tests, and a lot of people say, timing it isn't fair. It isn't, you try to create the same conditions for everyone, but people, process at different speeds and work differently. And so other things around equity and fairness that we should be aware of and that we should be thinking about. That was an excellent introduction to that. Other ideas about equity, fairness, testing?
So, I have something to add.
Go for it.
If that's okay.
A panelist.
Go for
yes.
it.
Yeah, not a panelist, but
Yeah.
so equity and fairness, right? So throughout my career as an educator, we've been measuring math and ELA only. What about civics? What about science?
Right.
What about the creative arts?
Yeah.
What about the multiple intelligences? So we can't talk about equity and fairness without including the breadth of intelligence and how diverse it is.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, so
I agree.
thank you. Two really important topics right there. One is learner variability. People are different, and we have to think about that with respect to equity and fairness. And the second is around making sure we're the whole range of standards and the whole range of topics and different kinds of brains, the creative brain and that kind of thing.
Yeah, we should definitely take a very holistic view on persons. That's one of the guiding principles for ACT. And just because we have to look at all the success factors in life. So what's needed for future success? And that will go far beyond the cognitive skills, equally important are non-cognitive. And just one example that came out recently, we are now developing a test of creative thinking for PISA, the PISA research. I think creative thinking is just an example of what's very important for people, and especially if you look at the future with more and more artificial intelligence coming in. And I'm not talking about testing or learning, but people will have to compete with machines maybe in the future, and then so things like creative thinking and critical thinking are more and more important.
Yeah,
I just wanted one insight to think about. So we have ESSA now with the freedom of assessment.
Yeah.
And how many states applied for the assessment innovation grants? One article came out a couple weeks ago, said one. I think we may be up to 2.
Yeah, Louisiana's submitted their proposal.
Yeah,
That's
even if it's
disappointing.
3, 47 to 3. One article I read the other day posited that the reason why they're not applying is, and I want to hit, the single word that probably is a barrier to a lot of this is policy. So many of our policies, so many of our requirements, so many of the guidelines that people are asking for are based off of older models.
Exactly.
Literally, you couldn't use adaptive assessments until about 7 or 8 years ago because the requirement was you had to assess on grade level. And if the assessment adapted and went off grade level, people said, oh, that must not meet the requirement. So we've got to get to some policymakers too and think about, there's some unintended consequences that are in there because we got a lot of policy written on some really old mindsets.
One quick round robin, last question. So if you were just going to kind of complete the sentence, assessment of the future, or we can say measurement in the future, like starting today, what are some of the design principles, like just quick round robin? Do you want to start?
Actually, I'll piggyback off something Joanna said about like the need for research. And one of the upshots, I guess, of so much technology being used and the opportunities for learning analytics and formative assessments all the way up to summative assessments is if tons of people are using, there's opportunities then to do live research at scale, A/B testing, controlled experiments where different variants of the different algorithms or something can be applied, and then you can look at the outcomes of the different groups like a randomized controlled trial. And so the assessments of the future, I think, will be more agile in how they are developed.
Excellent.
One sentence, we are out of time. So assessment of the future needs to realize that students are the most important consumers of information in the classroom.
So assessment should become integrated with learning and navigation, and so become like one integrated system.
I would say we have to move away from safe bet, statistically valid tests that are normed over a large audience and move into new innovation of how we measure the individual.
End of average, right?
And as a company that has built tests for many years, oftentimes very separate from the rest of the education community, assessment has to be done with the rest of the education community, not to. And so I really hope we can find ways to figure out how all of these pieces fit together, because assessment can have a positive role as well.
Yeah. Excellent. Please join me in thanking the panel.